Hard science fiction? You want to talk about hard science fiction? My science fiction is the hardest science fiction. When my space book was in the joint, it killed its cellmate with a pudding pop. If you mess with my space book, you wake up in a bathtub of Starbucks coffee with your organs missing. Hard science fiction. It's definitely one of those phrases that people like to use irresponsibly. The actual definition of hard science fiction is simple. It's SF with the emphasis on realistic science. Mainstream stories tend to blend technologically sound details with convenient ones that suit them, and there's a wide spectrum with plenty of distance between hard SF and the stuff that's pure fantasy. Most science fiction falls somewhere in the middle. Realism can be an asset to a story, or it can be a problem. It might sound strange to say it, but realism is just one more writing mechanic. Nearly all stories need to be believable in their own context, but that's not the same as being realistic. Even when the fantasy level is off the charts, the suspension of disbelief can still hold as long as the actions and motivations of the characters are believable, though in many cases, even when a story has no interest in being realistic, some considerations still have to be made. For example, a story set in space should at least acknowledge that there's no air and no gravity. If it ignores things as fundamental as that, it can be distracting. But as long as the bare minimum is met, as long as the story compels, people can usually get on board even if the science is way off. Star Wars is a good example of this. With everything from the ship designs to the World War II dogfighting in space, I won't bore you with a physics lesson, but it's pretty egregious. If there's ever a Star War, this is not what it's going to look like. But I don't mind. You don't mind. Nobody minds. It's Star Wars. It's great. It doesn't need to accurately depict space technology to be fun. Space is a science fiction staple, but space itself is pretty boring. Realistic space combat would be very abrupt, and it wouldn't leave much room for dramatic storytelling. Likewise, realistic space travel can be a problem thanks to how long it would take to get anywhere without faster-than-light travel. Writers focusing on the human element of a science fiction story might choose to ignore some of these things. Technical science is great, but the fact of the matter is that most of us don't miss it when it's gone, especially if we're being entertained. Obviously, we can't see the future, but if we're going to be serious about realism, we have to look at the patterns in history and the world around us and take our best guess. Life is becoming increasingly digitized. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does have implications for storytellers. It's hard to write a crime story set in a world where everything anyone does is tracked. We always know who did it, and we know where they are. So we bend the rules to keep the drama flowing. I'm not calling out Star Wars. My science fiction has swords in it too. Yet if we're being serious, lightsabers are inexcusable. But dramatic sword fights are great, so guess what? We're having them. Will there ever be manned fighter ships in space? No. In fact, if we ever get to that point, most ships won't even have cockpits. Look around you on the road and ask yourself if you'd trust those people with spaceships. Neither would I. But just because there will probably never be space fighter pilot aces doesn't mean they don't have a place in fiction. Firearms and combat on foot have changed throughout history, and they're going to keep changing. But the drama just won't be the same without guns that are really loud, and if everyone's weapons aim themselves and shoot through walls, as they will in the future. Depicting that realistically would give us some very short, very boring action scenes. Even if you could still have a gunfight in a realistic future, why would you? Why not just remotely lock the doors and drain the air from the room? There's no need for cops or car chases when law enforcement drones can just shoot people, or orbital weapons can hit anything on Earth at any moment. Robots don't miss. All this technology already exists. That future isn't set up to support the kind of stories that we're used to. It all comes down to style. Some writers will bend the world to suit their stories, and others will bend their stories to suit the world. There's no right or wrong way to do this. Both approaches can be interesting. Scientific realism can be great, but goofy airplanes in space are pretty great too. The hardcore science fiction that does its best to be true to life down to the last detail has an audience, and it has an important role in the genre, but so does Star Wars. Just like a magic system doesn't have to be the end-all for a fantasy novel, in science fiction, the science doesn't have to be the focus for us to have a good time. Though having said that, if you're going to write about space, it doesn't hurt to take a physics class or read a Carl Sagan book.